Welcome back to the Spirits, the Waters, and the Bloods. Matai Yahweh Da. Most definitely reaching out there. Want to send blessings, give thanks to the Father for being able to edify individuals and release another video for edification. Fair use, fair use, fair use. So today, well, Thawada Yahweh for giving me the opportunity to address individuals. Hopefully, you guide me with discernment so that way I can edify other individuals for your will, your way, your fame, your namesake. Hallelujah, Yahweh, Bahashem, Hamashiach, Yahweh Shah, Uvain Barakata, Ruach Kodeshecha. So now I want to thank everyone for tuning into your favorite Hebrew Israelites channel. Most definitely I'm Ian or Wayne, Wayan, Ian or Wayne, like I said before. And please take the time out to like, share, subscribe, hit the bell notification for whenever I release new content, so therefore you can receive it as soon as I release the new content. So today we're going to be doing a little thing to where we're going to have a little fun. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and we're going to go with the eldest brother today, which is Japheth, and I'm going to call this one Tracking Japheth. Hope you enjoy, and let me go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. As soon as I can see it. All right, hold on. Oh, there it is. Okay, we're going to make my picture a little bit bigger on the screen so you guys can see me as I narrate. Again, fair use, fair use, fair use. Everything I use is for edification, for one's knowledge, understanding, and growth. So with that being said, I want to most definitely, like I said before, reiterate a bit on to Japheth. We have Shem, unto Shem also the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth, the elder. The brother of Japheth, which is the elder. Which is the elder. Okay, so Japheth, which is the elder. So, here we go. With that being said, we're going to look right into Japheth, and we're going to call this one Tracking Japheth. Tracking Japheth. Tracking Japheth. Alright, so here we go. So now we're going to go ahead and go to here, Tracking Japheth. I didn't do that on here, but I did do it here. As a matter of fact, I'm going to pull it up on the screen so you guys can see it as I go along with it. So that way you'll be able to know or see it as it plays out. I mean, we'll see it firsthand. So let me stop sharing my screen for a second. Then I need to and I'm just checking to actually see if I can. I'm locating what I had on this pulled up earlier, so that way I can actually relate back to it, but I don't see it right there. So now I'm just looking around at the different Topics for Japheth. Japheth got questions? No. Let me see. Salakia, Miss Parker. Oh, okay. And as I'm looking through the different sites, let's go ahead and put this at the top. Salakia, I had everything laid out for a minute, but this is one that I didn't actually add, or one source that I didn't add into the equation, which is kind of the important one. So like I said before, stay tuned. I'm gonna get it to you. I'm gonna be able to go ahead and start this for you in a second. All right, let's go ahead and put that here. All right. Now we can go ahead and get started. All right, and this is coming from the Bible Gateway, International Version, NIV. Japheth. Elohim will make wide or enlarge one of the three sons of Noah. It is difficult to know if Japheth is the second or third son of Noah, but actually I just showed you that Japheth is the oldest son, so is the second or third son of Noah. In most of the passages referring to him in Genesis 5:32, 6:10, 7:13, 9:18, and all the rest of the books within the Bible, or the Word, the Holy Scripture, the Good News, the Light. Japheth is listed as the third or youngest son of his father. However, Genesis 9:22 and 24 seems to say that Ham, the father of Canaan, is the youngest. Genesis 10:21 has also been construct to support the idea that Japheth is the second son rather than the third son. But I just showed you that Japheth is the oldest. Japheth is the oldest. Sometime after the flood, Noah planted a vineyard and became drunk from the wine that he had made. In his drunken stupor, he laid uncovered in his tent. The youngest son, Ham, broke the contemporary moral code by looking upon his father's nakedness. Apparently, the episode came quite by accident, but intentionally or not, it was of sin in that time. He seems to have immediately told his brothers what had happened. Shem and Japheth placed a garment on their shoulders, and walking backwards covered their father without looking upon him. Thus they were not guilty of committing the sin of immorality, of being immoral. When Noah awoke and learned of the matter, he pronounced a curse upon Canaan, the son of Ham. Elohim enlarged Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan became his servant. Genesis 9:27. Later generations considered this as a prediction that the descendants of Shem and Japheth would live amicably together, and the Canaanites would be their servants. The subjugation of the Canaanites in the time of Joshua is supposed to be fulfillment of Noah's curse. Judah, stop. The blessings pronounced upon Japheth by his father carried with the idea that his descendants would be greatly multiplied, enlarged in the future. Japheth's descendants. The table of nations recorded in Genesis 10 indicates that Japheth became the father of a wide-ranging family of peoples. Japheth became a family of a wide-ranging family of peoples whose homes lay to the north and mostly west of Ham. In fact, 14 nations of Japheth are listed in Genesis 10. The idea of their occupation ranged all the way from the smelting plants of Tarshish, Spain, on the west to the Caspian Sea on the east. This includes what is now the steppes of southern Russia, most of Asia Minor and islands of the Mediterranean, and the coast of southern Europe. Japheth is said to be the father of Gomer, Magog, Media, Jovan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tyrus. Genesis 10, chapter and verse 10:2. 1 Chronicles 1:4. These are the generations of the Indo-European, Caucasian families of nations. I'll go on to finish it. I think that'll be finishing. Yeah, it'll be finishing it up. So I'll go ahead and finish it. Although all descendants of Japheth are more or less important to biblical history, the writer of Genesis 10 appears to single out the sons of Gomer and Javan for special attention. The descendants of Gomer seem to be the Gomorrah and Gomorrah of the Syrian chronicles, but known to the Greeks as Sumerians. The sons of Javan are the Greeks, i.e., the Lonians of Homer and ESP, especially the Lonians who lived along the coast of Western Asia Minor and the Isles of the Aegean Sea. All right, so now I took a little bit of time. In order to find out, or to track Japheth in order to see exactly where, Japheth, did he really exist? So that'll be another question for another individual. So with doing a particular search on the Indo-Europeans, I found this. Now, Indo-European languages, different nations. So now, I'm gonna pause right there with the Indo-European language. You have the Indo-European language, the Hamitic Indo-Europeans, Japheth. Hamitic, you have Ham. Shemitic, you have Sem or Shem. So Shem, Ham, and Japheth, or Japheth, Shem, and Ham. All right, with Japheth being the elder of the two. So then, just looking through, you can find out the list of European languages, Indo-European languages, the Indo-European family and languages, list of Indo-European languages, Indo-European languages, language family tree, Indo-European languages. So basically, I'm seeing proof that the Indo-Europeans did exist. They did exist. Parent language, Proto-Indo-European, and Britannica. So Britannica has, it's a reputable site that's actually saying that they did exist. History files. All right, so let's go to history files and see exactly what they have to say. All right, this is the history files. Support the history files in 2023 if you like, but it's given a description of these people, of the Indo-Europeans. All right, those people who are known as the Indo-Europeans, IEs, were the most widely ranged ethnic group in ancient times due to their existence on the steppes as cattle and horse-raising people. They were quite immobile and characteristic which they shared with other steppe nomads such as the Turkic and Hunnic peoples. The background of the Indo-Europeans. Indo-Europeans is supposed to be a member of a much older microfamily called Nordics. This includes the Uralic people, the Altic people, and the Kartvelian languages, with a lower probability also languages spoken in India, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. Kartvelian speaking tribes would have been close neighbors to the original Indo-Europeans in the Caucasian Mountains. The apparent differences between them would be that the Kartvelian speakers stayed home in the mountains while Indo-European speakers expanded. Salathia, while European expanded. This expansion was almost certainly caused by the adoption of horse-drawn wagons by the Indo-Europeans. This led to lead to the use of chariots in war and finally to riding horses for various purposes. There are various theories about the precise location of the original homeland. A personal learning is for the most probable theory that they were originally located somewhere on the northern edge of the Caucasus or the Caucasian Mountains. These form a range of peaks that sits between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and which today is largely within the borders of Georgia and the southern tip of Russia. The IEs or Indo-Europeans then expanded out from there, most of them going north into the steppes. And this gives an idea, the Caspian Sea here, the Black Sea over here. So they're saying that they formed somewhere around in this region, and then which Japheth, he migrated, he had his land to the northwest, and then Ham had his land to the south, I guess east or southwest, and then Shem had his land from the, so let's say, mid eastern range. All right, the northern edge of the Caucasus Mountains between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea is the most probable homeland for the Proto-European, cut off as they would have been from their fellow aristocrat speakers, meaning the rest of their family. But we already know that in the word it says Shem, Ham, and Japheth separated into their lands and then their nations and their tongues, their languages. Not like they was going, they wasn't doing that. They had languages. Just like if I was to start speaking Hebrew to a person, praising our Father, they would swear that I was speaking with the gift of tongues. But no, I'm speaking with the Rashwa Kodesh, the holy language, the blessed. All right, migration. A full timeline of events can be seen in the accompanying list. See the link in the sidebar, to the right. But a brief recap here would be useful. The separation of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, PIE, PI, 3.14, but the Proto-European language from its parent narcissistic tongue took place approximately at the 6,000 BC mark. The 6,000 BC mark. So it's pushing it a little off. But when you go with these archaeology, or when you go with, like, say, how old the Earth is, I believe that they're off with their time frame and their calendar system, and everything needs to be shifted 1,500 to 1,000 years before that time. All right, so going on. Mark, see the first map above. All right, we saw that. One can speculate that this occurred via or by isolation in the mountainous region, hence favoring the Caucasus Mountains as a homeland. This would be prior to Kurgan hypothesis homeland. The beginnings of Indo-European expansion took place around 4000 BC. After the flood, 4000 BC, see map 2, and with it the beginning of aerial dialects, You had the Hamitic, Shemitic, and now Indo-European languages, which is English is a form of an Indo-European language. All right, so now going on. And with it, the beginning of aerial dialects. The Anatolian dialect began to move southwards, signifying the migration of one group of Indo-Europeans away from the rest. So Japheth's sons started to spread out. Most of the others appear to have begun an expansion northwards, headed towards headed into Europe and a little further west, northward into the Pontic Caspian steppes. Was the horse domesticated and the horse-drawn wagon adopted at this time? This is the Kurgan hypothesis homeland period, also known as the Pontic steppe hypothesis, with the majority of Indo-Europeans inhabiting the steppes to the north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. The archaeological evidence so far is too inclusive to provide a definite source of origin for the Indo-Europeans, and some of the more outlandish theories place it far away from the region, but the Pontic steppes is the favorable theory, or the favorite theory. These early Indo-Europeans were identified by scholars with warrior pastoralists who built kurgan burial mounds, a Turkic loan word in Russian, which is often used to identify the Indo-European prior to their expansion, in the steppes of the north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea in what is now southern Russia and Ukraine. However, the core of this particular study focuses on the expansions as shown by language shifted rather than other means. So now you see the expansion of the Indo-European families going all the way out. And Salathia. Shown by language shifts rather than other means. Okay. The initial expansion of Indo-Europeans took place around 4000 BC, with one group headed southward while the main body expanded into the Pontic-Caspian steppes, a vast stretch of plains to the north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. Click or tap on the map to review. And like I said before, if you want to get a little bit more information, you could go to this particular website again, and I'll show it to you. The history files, and the link to it is right here. So if you need a little bit of time, pause the video right there and I guess write it down, and then you'll be able to actually access it, or just catch this featured Far East, Central Asia, Indo-European. Alright, so now going on. Alright, I'll pick back up right here. Early in this western group's expansion, one tribe apparently headed eastward instead of west, perhaps forced to do so by, for instance, becoming divided from the main mass of Western Indo-Europeans. From the whole entire group of them, they started to branch off. They separated with their families, their languages, and their tongue, to evolve into the Tocharian branch of Indo-Europeans. Turkic, Tocharian, or Tocharian. Alright, a northwestern branch began the German ethnic group. A northern branch founded what will become Baltic and Slavic peoples. Proto-Greeks formed a western branch, probably along the Tarsians, Dacians, and the Phrygians, all of which seem to have been related to the Armenians, all related to the Armenians, and Eastern or stay-at-home branch, apparently calling themselves Arya, or something similar, form the ancestors of Indians, Karoots, Iranians, Minians, Medians, and related peoples. Language division theories. Alright, so now we see the language division theories. I won't go into that, about the splitting of the Indo-languages. I mean, basically, so with this being said, that these group of people did exist, and they're the fathers or the progenitors of Indo-European languages and Indo-European ethnic groups. So basically, we see that they exist. So westward branch, southern branch. Okay, I can stop here. All right, and I'm going to stop here. So now, which brings it to the highlight, the actual tracking of the people. Like I said before, fair use, fair use, fair use. I'm using this particular video just for edification, so individuals can grasp a full knowledge of the Indo-Europeans and the formulation of what's known today as Europe, and tracking Japheth. We're going to find out what happened to Japheth? Is Japheth still around? Is his bloodline still around? Are his people still around? Just like Shem's people are still around? Just like Ham's people are still around? Is Japheth still around? So basically, I hope you enjoy this particular clip. It's going to actually cover everything that you need to know about the Indo-Europeans. I briefly gave descriptions showing that Japheth really did exist, who Japheth is. I did some identifying with Japheth. So therefore, we're going to go ahead and use this in order, I'm going to present this short, well, it's not short, I'm going to present this slide to you. So therefore, you can grasp a strong clarity, just in case I went through it too fast, for your edification, for your purposes, for your study tool. Fair use, fair use, fair use. Stay tuned, and most definitely bless you all that bless me with a like, share, subscribe, and a bell notification. And if that's too hard for you and you're just here to learn and dash, then barakatah you as well. Bless you as well. So here we go.
These languages all come from Proto-Indo-European speakers of the Yamnaya and corded ware cultures. The Yamnaya people were indigenous to the Eastern European steppe during the Neolithic and early Bronze Age. Using their skulls and about 46% of the world's population speaks an Indo-European language as a first language, and the majority of humans About 46% of the world's population speaks an Indo-European language as a first language, and the majority of humans on Earth can speak at least one Indo-European language, such as English, Spanish, or Hindi. These languages all come from Proto-Indo-European speakers of the Yamnaya and corded ware cultures. The Yamnaya people were indigenous to the Eastern European steppe during the Neolithic and early Bronze Age. Using their skulls and the latest genetic data about their appearance, the 3D artist Robert Molyneux was able to create realistic reconstructions of Yamnaya people for this video. So at last, we can get a good idea of what they looked like. But before we look at those, let's talk about who the Yamnaya were. And what does Yamnaya mean anyway? The name Yamnaya was given to them by archaeologists and simply means related to pits, because these people buried their dead in pits, sometimes with stairs leading down into them, and usually with an enormous barrow, also known as a kurgan, erected on top of them. The dead and the pits are sometimes sprinkled with red ochre, such that the Yamnaya culture is also called the late ochre grave culture. And they're typically oriented west-east, lying on their backs with their knees raised, although later on their dead were sometimes buried on their sides. The high-status males are often accompanied by weapons such as stone axes and bronze daggers. Bronze weapons would have been elite status symbols, as stone was still widely used for many tools and weapons. While the first iron smelting is generally associated with Hittite Anatolia, from as early as 2000 BC maybe, there were actually experimental examples of smelted iron blades and pins from the early Bronze Age steppe centuries earlier. This shows Yamnaya blacksmiths were pioneering innovators, and that their historical significance is undervalued. Some of the barrow burials were accompanied by stone stelae, which give us some insight into the way these people looked. They are depicted with multiple weapons in their belts, or with shepherd's crooks, sometimes wearing tunics and sandals, other times naked, except for a belt, and shaping their beards into points, just as the Vikings did. At least 300 stelae have been found in Yamnaya and catacomb barrows in the North Pontic steppes, usually reused as grave pit covers. It is impossible to say whether these stelae represent gods or ancestors, or whether these people even thought that distinction was meaningful. The stelae tradition continued on the steppes among Iron Age Scythians and medieval Turkic hordes for a long time afterwards. The grave fields of Yamnaya barrows are mainly found in the river valleys, while barrows in the open steppe are less common and date to a later period, perhaps when attitudes to the steppe were changing and Yamnaya people sought to claim portions of it, using the barrow as a territorial marker. The barrow so typifies the Yamnaya people that some call them the Kurugan people, a convention established by Maria Gimbutas, and Kurugan means barrow. The barrow spread with Indo-European languages, such that ancient Greeks, Celts, Vikings, Slavs, Anglo-Saxons, Scythians and others preserved the custom for thousands of years after the Yamnaya disappeared. Archaeologist Arlin Frinkuliesa wrote that the Yamnaya barrow seems a monument and at the same time a representation of the ideological power of this intrusive group. The establishment of lineage could ensure the passage in time and space of the unity of tradition and the relevance of ideology. At the top of the social pyramid stood a male figure symbolically endowed with the power of representing the continuity, stability, cohesion and unity of society. The homogeneity of this funerary phenomenon was visible for more than half a millennium and preserved the same coordinates until the end of the evolution of this tradition. We can assume that heredity, descendants, was an important landmark in the Yamnaya society. The culture was preceded by other archaeologically and genetically similar ones, such as Sredni Stog, Repin culture around the Don, and further to the north, toward the Middle Volga, the Falinsk culture. The skulls of people around the Volga in the late Stone Age are very robust. If anyone has a skull like this today, then you had better hope he is in prison, because he is likely a dangerous man. Yamnaya skeletons are not quite as robustly built, nor their skulls typified by such robust features, but they are still pretty robust. Look at the chin on this Yamnaya guy's skull. He almost reminds me of Giga Chad. The Yamnaya spread rapidly across the Pontic-Caspian steppes between about 3,400 and 3,200 BC. Then, from 3000 BC to 2500 BC, it pushed westward into Romania and Hungary. David Anthony, a renowned expert on Indo-Europeans, notes that Yamnaya settlements are limited to the region west of the Don River in Ukraine. But the eastern Yamnaya territories, east of the Don in South Russia, are devoid of settlements, and that this is most likely because the eastern Yamnaya were more nomadic, living out of wagons and tents. The Yamnaya expanded northeastward up the Volga and also west towards the Carpathians and the area north of the Danube in modern Romania as far as Transylvania, and also further west even into the plains of Hungary. Despite being genetically very homogeneous, the skull type varies among Yamnaya people, with northeastern Yamnaya towards the Volga exhibiting dolichocephalic skulls, while Yamnaya nearer to the Black Sea are brachycephalic, meaning they have rounder skulls. Males and females are typified by straight foreheads, broad faces, prominent nasal bones, and straight jaws. The males have prominent brow ridges. The east-west divide among Yamnaya peoples is evident not only in their skulls, but also in the impressions of cultivated grain found in western Yamnaya pottery, which are absent in eastern Yamnaya pottery. Those in the west had stronger contacts with their semi-urbanized neighbors of the Neolithic Cucutenic Tropilia culture, and so grain formed a larger part of their diet. while Eastern Yamnaya remained less civilized and maintained contacts with forager peoples in Russia. The massive skull type of Yamnaya males is not typical of any people alive today, but tallness is most common in Northern Europe, where levels of Yamnaya admixture are higher, and height correlates with increased Yamnaya ancestry among Europeans. However, the average male Yamnaya height varied from 170 to 177 centimeters, which isn't that tall today, but was tall for the time, especially compared to contemporary farmers of Western Europe.
Wait till you see the...
However, at least some of the Yamnaya were a lot taller. A male Yamnaya skeleton found in a barrow in the village of Vitrino in Bulgaria has been dubbed Hercules by the locals. Judging by femur length, they can be certain he was at least 190 centimeters tall, and possibly taller. A new study this year looked at the DNA of Estonian people and found that the genomes of taller individuals tend to be more similar to Yamnaya. They also found that Yamnaya ancestry correlated and is linked to higher rates of cholesterol, and stronger bodies, and larger hip and waist circumferences. Yamnaya DNA was also linked to dark hair and eye colour in modern Estonians, and by inference other Northern Europeans, and also with lower rates of caffeine consumption. Genetic analysis reveals that Yamnaya people were light-skinned, like Europeans, but were darker than the average Northern European is today. A 2017 study by Haid showed that Yamnaya inherited the allele associated with blonde hair from their ancient North Eurasian ancestors. They also had genes for blue eyes inherited from Western hunter-gatherers. However, all of the Yamnaya skeletons tested are predicted to have brown or black hair, and most have brown eyes, suggesting that blue eyes and blonde hair were both rare among them. But over the course of the Bronze Age, Yamnaya descended peoples underwent selection pressure that favoured lighter skin and higher rates of blonde hair and blue eyes, meaning that these dormant genes were more commonly expressed by the Late Bronze Age, even though they had been present long before. This is why Europeans with lighter skin and blonde hair are likely to have more Yamnaya DNA than darker Europeans, even though the Yamnaya themselves were less fair. This first reconstruction is of a Yamnaya male interred in the lower Volga region in the eastern Yamnaya territories. His features are also notably robust, particularly his chin and brow, but his skull is long, typical of the dolichocephalic eastern Yamnaya type. The artist Robert Molyneux used photos of the skull to create a 3D model of it to work from. Then, following the revised Gerasimov method described by Ulrich and Stefan, he was able to calculate precise flesh thickness around each part of the skull. Then he added skin, referring to genetic data on the most plausible complexion of Yamnaya people. We have reconstructed him with brown eyes and dark hair, which is statistically likely for his people, although we don't have his personal DNA to check what colour hair he specifically had. His beard is pointed, just like the stelae, and his skin tone is at the darker end of the European spectrum. Compare him to this more western man from Novo-Alexievka near the Crimean Peninsula in Ukraine. He is more brachycephalic than the Volga man, but actually there are much rounder western Yamnaya skulls than this one. We have depicted him with silver hair coils, as these are found in numerous Yamnaya burials, although we cannot know for sure how they were really worn. This map shows the amount of Yamnaya admixture present in modern populations. It is highest in the parts of northern and eastern Europe, which were less densely populated when Yamnaya-related peoples, known by geneticists as Western steppe herders, spread across the continent between 5,000 and 4,200 years ago. The southern regions were also impacted by invasions of Yamnaya-related peoples, such as the Catacomb culture and the Belbeaker folk, but the population replacement was not as extreme as it was in places like Britain, where it resulted in over 90% of the population being replaced by Belbeaker folk from Holland. David Anthony wrote that the rapid spread of Yamnaya peoples suggests a competitive advantage and an aggressive exploitation of it. More recent studies give us hints at what these advantages were. We have already established that they were taller than their neighbours in the west, but they also seem to have been more warlike. Neolithic Europeans had stone axes and stone-tipped arrows and are known to have slaughtered each other, so they were no pacifists. But the presence of weapons in Yamnaya burials, some of them made from state-of-the-art bronze, hints that perhaps these were a particularly warlike people, even more so than Neolithic Europeans. In Eulau, Germany, a mass grave of late Neolithic globular amphora people was found, who it is presumed were massacred by the Yamnaya-related corded ware invaders of the time. This video is sponsored by Gothic, which is an online jewellery retailer selling unique handmade jewellery. They're celebrating their 2nd anniversary, so there's a sale on. They kindly sent me these items for me to wear, and I can tell you they are of a decent quality. Elf of Ancient Hominins claimed that the success of Indo-Europeans may not be entirely down to sheer force of violence. A study by Behrens and colleagues in 2017 entitled The Genomic Health of Ancient Hominins claimed that ancient pastoralists may have had healthier genomes than hunter-gatherers or agriculturalists. They found that in general, pastoralists possess extremely healthy genomes, especially for cancers and immune-related periodontal and gastrointestinal diseases. Back in 2015, Garnier and colleagues used linguistic evidence to argue that Yamnaya Indo-Europeans were among the first people with the ability to digest raw milk in their adult lives. This was argued just on the basis of words for milk and milk products in Indo-European vocabulary. If correct, this would give them an edge over other people, since they benefit from the highly nutritious fats and proteins of milk without having to process it into cheese, like others had to in order to digest it. This theory was somewhat vindicated in a 2020 genetic study by Sarg and colleagues, which showed that about a quarter of Yamnaya people tested had the genes for lactase persistence, which would make them lactose tolerant in adulthood. These genes became much more common over the Bronze Age through a process of selection which also resulted in lighter skin and hair. Even if only a quarter of Yamnaya men could drink raw milk, that would still bestow an advantage, and may have contributed to their tall, strong bodies. Hot off the press! A new study by Wilkin and colleagues published in September 2021 has analysed protein on the teeth of Yamnaya and other steppe peoples to determine their diet. The oldest samples dated from 4600 to 4000 BC and came from 5 Neolithic sites in southwestern Russia, some associated with the Khvalynsk culture. Of the 11 which yielded results, none are confirmed to have consumed dairy. But 15 of the 16 early Bronze Age Yamnaya horizon samples which yielded results were found to have consumed dairy, and 2 of these specifically consumed horse milk. This not only proves the Yamnaya diet was high in dairy, but also proved they domesticated horses and milked them. This lends weight to the theory that they also rode their horses, since they got much more milk from cows and didn't need horses just for milk. The results point to a potential epicenter for horse domestication in the Pontic-Caspian steppe by the 3rd millennium BC, and it also shows that Yamnaya were the specific steppe culture which instigated the tradition of consuming dairy. Archaeological evidence indicates they had a diet of beef, mutton, saiga venison, horse meat, pork, fish which they caught in the rivers of the valleys, yogurt, butter, cheese, and soups made from wild chenopodium seeds and wild greens. The reconstructed Proto-Indo-European vocabulary tells us that honey and honey-based mead were also consumed, probably on special occasions, and some of their pots and beakers were likely used in ceremonial mead-drinking rituals, the sort we see in other, later Indo-European cultures. Analysis of Yamnaya pots shows that most have no trace of grains, and Yamnaya teeth are usually free of tooth decay, which occurs when people eat starchy and grain-based diets. However, some, particularly in the West, did rely a bit on grains like millet. The Yamnaya were very strong and healthy because their diet was similar to that of hunter-gatherers, except for the fact it was so high in dairy. So high, in fact, that some Yamnaya children from the Middle Volga area were anemic, likely due to excessive dairy consumption, which can block iron absorption. But this was not so widespread as to have changed the fact that they were generally a very big and strong race compared to their neighbours to the west and to the south. It has been argued by some scientists that Yamnaya carried some immunity to the plague virus, which they carried into Neolithic Western and Northern Europe, devastating the indigenous populations. This was based on a 2015 study which found that the earliest version of the plague virus, which later devastated Europe in the medieval era, and before that during the reign of Justinian in Roman times, was first present in the Yamnaya people. However, in 2018, a paper titled Emergence and Spread of Basal Lineages of Yersinia pestis During the Neolithic Decline reported the discovery of an earlier lineage of the plague present in the Neolithic funnel beaker culture of Sweden, predating the arrival of steppe herder DNA. The authors, Rasmussen and Raskoven, proposed that this early strain may have contributed to a Neolithic collapse, the first ever pandemic, which they alleged facilitated the rise of the Yamnaya later on, who themselves brought a second variant of plague, which we assume the natives were not as resistant to, thus helping Yamnaya people to dominate. This year, another paper has found an even older strain of plague in a hunter-gatherer from Latvia. I personally think that the role of plague in the spread of steppe herder DNA over the Bronze Age is exaggerated and lacks evidence. Another advantage that can explain the success of Yamnaya people was their mobility. The weather on the steppes became warmer and drier at the end of the Neolithic between 5,000 and 5,500 years ago.
How dare you!
And this may have contributed to the shift to transhumance among the sheep-herding pastoralists of the region. The Yamnaya people became more mobile, using wagons to move their homes with the seasons and drive their sheep and cattle to seasonal pastures, driving their herds on the open steppe in summer and frequently moving them around during the winter, often through the sheltered and forested river valleys. Anthony writes, "The behavior that really set the Yamnaya people apart was living on wheels. Their new economy took advantage of 2 kinds of mobility: wagons for slow bulk transport, water, shelter and food, and horseback riding for rapid light transport, scouting for pastures, herding, trading and raiding expeditions. Together, they greatly increased the potential scale of herding economies." David Anthony has essentially argued that Yamnaya people invented and pioneered this way of life. Reconstructed linguistics show that Proto-Indo-Europeans had words for horses and wheels, and the Yamnaya archaeology confirms that they did have access to both, but they didn't invent wheels or wagons. The oldest image of a wagon is on a clay cup, securely dated to 3500 to 3300 BC from Bronichice in southern Poland. And the oldest wheel ever found was in the Ljubljana marshes in Slovenia, dated to approximately 3150 BC. So it seems possible wheels and wagons were invented in Eastern Europe, in which case Yamnaya took this technology from their neighbours to the west. However, many insist, despite lack of evidence, that Middle Eastern people surely invented wheels and wagons even earlier, in which case Yamnaya could have learned the technology from someone to their south, most likely the Maikop people. The largest concentration of Yamnaya wagon burials is in the region adjacent to the steppe Maikop culture. So there is that. In any case, the wheel and wagon were both essential to the Yamnaya culture, not only for practical purposes like moving their tents and belongings, but also as part of their funerary customs. Wagon burials are found in all Yamnaya territories, but among the furthest western Yamnaya, near the Danube, the custom seems to have been associated mainly with female graves. The oldest excavated wagon graves in the steppes are radiocarbon dated to about 3100 to 3000 BC, but it is unlikely they were the first wagons on the steppe. Wagons were likely on the steppe before a wagon-dependent Yamnaya culture ever developed. The wagons were not necessarily drawn by horses either. People in Eastern Europe and the Middle East who used wagons at that time, and earlier than Yamnaya did, drew them with oxen. But the Yamnaya were among the first people in the world to ride domestic horses. It was previously believed that the Batai people in Kazakhstan were the first to domesticate horses, but DNA evidence shows their horses became the modern Przewalski's horse breed, which lives wild in Mongolia today. A new paper by Taylor and Ortiz says that there is no solid evidence that Batai ever domesticated their horses. All modern horse breeds take only about 2% of their DNA from Batai horses, and descend mainly from another group of domesticated horses, which in all probability are related to those of the Yamnaya.
Now when we get to later cultures in the Bronze Age, the Yamnaya and Sintashta, the advantage might well have been considerably greater, that it might have been much heavier equestrian use of horses, allowing them much faster transportation, better trade, but also considerable military advantage over other people, allowing those cultures to spread. And we know that both those cultures did major spreading, so it could have aided them in their conquest of other areas. They were quite clearly seen by those people as something of a status symbol, particularly in the later cultures. The horses are often buried in graves, illustrating that they were a high status thing to have. So if you start combining military prowess, warrior peoples with that, you can see how that develops into a completely different sort of culture that is engaged in conquest. And it may well have helped them spread their form of technology and language, etc. around. The whole question of the status of the horse with the Yamnaya is actually not completely clear. There is no question that the Yamnaya had some horses in their faunal assemblages, but there's actually not such good evidence as to exactly how they were used. So what do we know? We know the Yamnaya had wheeled vehicles. They weren't chariots, they were heavier, solid-wheeled carts. Those carts could have been pulled by horses, but they could equally have been pulled by oxen. We very much suspect the horses in Yamnaya are domestic ones, because of the way they appear in the assemblages, and they might well have been used in assisting them in herding and transport. But it is much less obvious in Yamnaya at the current level of research as to exactly what the role of them is. We equally don't know much about the genetics yet of Yamnaya horses, and we will do very shortly. I mean, within a year, probably less than that, within months, we will know a lot more about the genetics of Yamnaya horses. So it's not entirely clear to what extent the horses were spread by the Yamnaya or by Bronze Age peoples following them in terms of their interaction with European horses. But that is something we will know very shortly.
I recently made a video about the importance of horse sacrifices in Indo-European cultures, where they generally seem to relate to the cult of the king. This custom undoubtedly originates in the Yamnaya culture. A Yamnaya barrow near Tsatsa, south of the Volga, contained a horse skull, likely from a sacrifice. A neighbouring barrow in the same cemetery, dating to 2500 BC, the time of the catacomb culture, just after the Yamnaya period, contained 40 horse skulls, neatly arranged in 2 rows. 40 horses of this size would provide enough meat to serve 4,000 portions of horse meat. So we can imagine an enormous funeral event with a very bloody sacrificial scene and thousands of people in attendance enjoying the meat in the company of their gods and their honoured dead. But how would wagons and horses have helped Western steppe herders to spread into the forested regions of Northern and Western Europe? Forests are not very good for pastoralists. A 2020 study by Rassimo and colleagues from the University of Copenhagen and the University of Plymouth determined that the arrival of steppe pastoralists at the end of the Neolithic was associated with even more deforestation than the arrival of the Anatolian farmers when they brought farming to Europe at the start of the Neolithic. This is surprising, since comparative mythology proves the Indo-Europeans considered some trees, such as the oak, to be sacred. But even so, they needed to graze their vast herds of cattle, and for that they needed grasslands. The herds required even more land than the wheat fields of the Neolithic Europeans, since the pastoralists needed both summer and winter pastures. The scientists in Devon and Denmark were able to demonstrate how this deforestation coincided with the spread of steppe herder DNA, associated first with the Yamnaya and later with the corded ware culture. These pastoralists turned vast swathes of broadleaf forests into a landscape which resembled their original home on the steppes. The Jutland Peninsula in Denmark has remained mostly treeless since that time, but was once covered in forests. The initial expansion of Yamnaya and corded ware people might therefore be explained partly by the need for more pasture land, but later expansion of the related Belgica people is more plausibly explained by an ambition to acquire control of the tin mines in Britain and Iberia. Male lineages can be detected and traced genetically through the Y haplogroup. And the haplogroup phylogenies of the Yamnaya people indicate they had patrilineal social organizations. The main haplogroup among them is overwhelmingly R1b Z2103. R1b haplogroups today are mainly associated with Western and Northwestern Europeans, although people in these regions carry different subclades from the Yamnaya. And these different subclades of R1b were brought to the west of Europe by Yamnaya-related peoples of the Belgica culture. And we know they were related to the Yamnaya people because of their autosomal DNA, even though their subclade has not yet been found among Yamnaya skeletons. The vocabulary for kin relations in reconstructed Proto-Indo-European also supports what the haplogroups show, that they lived in a patrilineal, patrilocal social world in which rights, possessions, and responsibilities were inherited from the father. Women would leave their families to be with the families of their husbands. Related kinship terms referring to grandfather, father, brother, and husband's brother survive in nearly all Indo-European languages, but the equivalent terms for the wife's family are less certain and more variable. Our archaeological evidence of Yamnaya people is mainly limited to the high-status individuals who were buried in the barrows. This might somewhat distort our idea of them as a people, but the barrows don't always just contain one man. Frequently there is one person in a central burial, and a few other adults and children are buried adjacent to them. Children never take the central place in a barrow, but women sometimes do, which shows that despite having a patriarchal, warlike culture, certain women held high and respected positions in Yamnaya society. The prominence of women in barrows varies regionally. In the lower and the middle Volga regions, 80% of the Yamnaya graves contained males, suggesting a more patriarchal regional culture for the Volga-Ural region. In Ukraine, males also predominated, but not as strongly. While in the region north of the Caucasus, adjacent to the Mykop culture, men and women are nearly equally represented in the central graves of barrows as well as in barrows in general. Perhaps this is due to the influence of a less patriarchal Mykop society in the Caucasus. It is worth noting, though, that even in the Volga region, the central graves in barrows were not always occupied by men. So even in the most drug-like Yamnaya territories, they knew how to respect women. Since at least 2015, genetic evidence has conclusively proven the steppe hypothesis to be correct, at least insofar as the steppe is the source of the majority of Indo-European languages in Europe and Asia throughout history. However, Sir Colin Renfrew's Anatolian origin hypothesis, which he himself has abandoned, lingers on in a new form among the very geneticists who disproved his theory. The debate now centres on the origin of the Yamnaya themselves, since it is widely agreed they did speak at least a late form of Proto-Indo-European. As a group, they are extremely homogeneous, even across vast distances, such that Yamnaya-related peoples in Slovenia share recent ancestors with autosomally similar people of the Afanasyevo culture all the way in the Altai 4,000 odd miles to the east. So they were not prone to mixing. However, their genetic profile can be modelled as a two-way mixture event between indigenous hunter-gatherers from the Volga region, known as Eastern Hunter-Gatherers or EHG, and another population from the south who were related to people from the Caucasus and are thus named Caucasian Hunter-Gatherers or CHG. But where did the CHG signal in Yamnaya people come from? The paternal lineages of Yamnaya-related peoples can be attributed without controversy to the EHG people, who can be identified as a people who lived near or on the steppes in the Mesolithic. But the origin of the CHG-related signal is yet to be conclusively proven. Top genetic scientists at Harvard and others associated with the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig have argued in various ways that the CHG signal comes from the south of the Caucasus. A paper by Lazaridis and colleagues, published in 2016, associated the signal with Neolithic farmers from what is now Iran, while a 2019 paper by Wang and colleagues essentially claimed, in the preprint, that the source of CHG-like DNA in Yamnaya was the Mykop culture, which would make the Mykop the original Proto-Indo-Europeans, but this controversial idea is by no means universally accepted. There are problems with these ideas. Firstly, the CHG signal in Yamnaya is more closely related to hunter-gatherers from what is now Georgia than to Iranian Neolithic farmers, which makes sense. Why would Neolithic Middle Easterners cross the mountains to live with hunter-gatherers on the harsh steppes of Russia, and then interbreed with them, but leave no male lineages? Professor David Anthony, who is himself now part of the Harvard team working under David Reich, appeared on Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning podcast this year and shed some light on the issue.
And I'm trying to square these observations to put together the fact that they're surprisingly homogeneous genetically which means that they've gone through a bottleneck. There is a bottleneck at the origin of Yamnaya, or just before the origin of Yamnaya, that we have to explain. And you see the same basic formula with EHG and CHG in these populations, with a climb that goes from more CHG in the south to less CHG in the north, and then once you get into the forest zone, you're into pure EHG with no CHG at all. Chvalinsk is the largest cemetery of the pre-Yamnaya era in this eastern region, and it has everything except the added ancestry from European farmers. It's just pure EHG and CHG. And you can see these two components coming together from the north and the south. The pre-Yamnaya population was admixing as a process between northern forest-derived population coming down these ribbon-like river valleys and a southern derived population that we actually don't have the origin of yet. A pure CHG population we have not found in the steppes, but they have to have gotten into the steppes from the Caucasus before 6500 BC, because after that date, which is a long time before Yamnaya, because after that date, the populations in the Caucasus were admixed with Anatolian farmers from Western Anatolia. And the populations in the steppes don't have any Anatolian farmer at all. So this pure CHG had to have left the Caucasus before that admixture with Anatolian farmers happened. And that had to have been before 6500 BC. By 6000 BC, people in Western Iran and the Caucasus and Anatolia are completely admixed with Anatolian farmer and CHG. And up in the steppes, you just get the CHG by itself mixing with EHG.
Where does the mix happen, and when does it happen? If it happens, and I think I took this from your discussion with David Anthony, that believes that it most likely had to happen very early, at around 6000 BC or something like that. That is, I think, sufficiently early that it would put the entire homeland somehow north of the Black Sea.
So, we now know that the CHG-like component was on the steppes and up the Volga long before Yamnaya culture appears, as early as 8,000 years ago, and that it can't have come from any Neolithic population south of the mountains, because those populations all had Anatolian DNA, which is absent from the early Yamnaya people. David Anthony doesn't say it here, but this so-called CHG signal likely originates in the northern part of the Caucasus or on the steppe itself, and in any case was likely in the steppe before the Neolithic even started, when it was still all just hunter-gatherers, and therefore the earliest Proto-Indo-European speakers, who were pastoralists, must have lived on the steppes. I should also specify that Yamnaya and also even earlier steppe peoples were not just EHG and CHG, but they also had admixture from Western European hunter-gatherers, WHG, as well as from Neolithic European farmers. But these genetic signals seem to enter the steppe gene pool after the CHG and EHG mixing event. You can learn more about Mesolithic European hunter-gatherers like Cheddar Man in my video on that subject. In conclusion, if a Yamnaya person was walking down the street today, providing he was dressed in modern clothes, he wouldn't actually stand out from the crowd much. He would look like a well-built white man. Phenotype is inherited from one's ancestors, but selective pressure over time can change the way a people look without influence from foreign populations. Hence, the people with the most Yamnaya DNA alive today have fairer skin than Yamnaya people. Besides our looks, the main thing modern people have taken from the Indo-European steppe herders is their language, which, like their looks, has also changed over time, evolving into languages like the one I'm speaking now, English. A quick thank you to the artists who contributed work for this video. Besides the incredible facial reconstructions by Robert Molyneux, there were also these two beautiful paintings by Christian Sloane Hall, one depicting a Yamnaya man and woman at sunset with their horses, and the other depicting a fierce Yamnaya warrior. I worked hard with him to get the weapons, hair and clothing right for these images. The warrior is available on a range of garments in my store. A 3D model of Christian's Yamnaya warrior was also created by Roy Douglas, adding another dimension to this character. The Twitter artist known as Graman created this artwork of a Yamnaya burial, and the Ukrainian artist Valentin Kolontai created this art of the famous Karamazovsky Yamnaya idol, which is also available on shirts in my spring shop. See the links below the video. I've recently been deplatformed from Facebook for no reason at all. Obviously, I have powerful enemies. Those enemies are your enemies too, if you care about celebrating European history, because some people don't want me to be allowed to do that. That's why it's so important that you stand up against these people by helping me to continue doing this important work. I need your support. If you become a patron on Patreon or Subscribestar, you will get access to exclusive content, which I've been making for years just for my patrons.
Fair use, fair use, fair use. Until next time, Shalom.